Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast Progressive Republic. I'm your host, Landon Mitchell. I'm an author and political commentator looking to discuss leftist perspectives online. Today, we're back with a great friend of the podcast, Matt McManus, who's about to become a professor at Spelman University, if I believe. Matt, for those who aren't familiar with you, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, no problem. Well, first off, it's great to be back here. And as you mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at Spelman College in the Department of Political Science. And I've written a couple of books like The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism or my book, The Political Right and Equality.
Thank you very much. And so the reason I brought Professor McManus onto the podcast today is that I thought with the midterm elections coming up on November 3rd, 2026, important date, that we would spend some time discussing the Trump administration, particularly with respect to Trump's oligarchy. Now, I feel like looking back at the second Trump administration, we're really stuck in the middle of what Steve Bannon called flooding the zone with bullshit. Like the deliberate strategy of just lying and lying and lying and misdirection and doing so many things that it's honestly hard for people to keep up with. And it all, like, especially early on, had like this kind of shock effect to it. Um, how have you, as a scholar, been staying up on all of this stuff that's been going on? Because I've been having a hard time doing it. I mean, someone will say, "Oh yeah, Trump pardoned the January 6th rioters." I'm like, "Oh yeah, I almost forgot that that happened." You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I don't think it's all that surprising. They've been pretty transparent about what their intentions would be during the second administration, which included their desire to be more prepared than the first Trump administration in 2016, so that they could more effectively implement their agenda. But in terms of the kind of authoritarian maneuvers that you've seen Trump 2.0 undertake, just look at the kind of influences that the Republicans have been drawing upon recently, both domestic and internationally. Right, domestically, you've seen figures like Bronze Age pervert and Curtis Yarvin really kind of ascend to premier status in terms of the movers and shakers of conservative ideology in MAGAdom. And all of them tend to endorse a pretty authoritarian worldview or an outright authoritarian worldview in the case of people like Yarvin. And then, if you look internationally, you'll see that, between 2020 and 2024, things like Viktor Orban's illiberal democracy, which is neither particularly illiberal and problematically or questionably democratic, were often cited as the kind of model that they wanted to emulate. Tucker Carlson took a pilgrimage to Budapest to learn from it. Orban obviously spoke to the Republican Party and congratulated, Trump and other Trumpists for their electoral victories. This goes on, right? So if people are a bit surprised that this administration is a lot more militant in trying to advance its goals, then unfortunately, I have to say that worse things are probably yet to come.
Right. And Orban is actually now on Trump's so-called Gaza peace board. But I want to go back
Mhm.
to Curtis Yarvin, who's like a sort of neo-monarchist, if I recall correctly. Do you think there's kind of parallels between that and the kind of like unitary executive theory that Trump has been putting forward?
Yeah, absolutely right. So, unitary executive theory refers to a theory of presidential powers, a constitutional theory of presidential powers, that holds that the president should be given expansive leeway in terms of determining what his own responsibilities and rights happen to be, especially when it comes to issues of national security. You saw people like John Yoo and Antonin Scalia push very heavily for the adoption of this interpretation of the Constitution and the president's powers during the war on terror, in particular, right? But I think that what we're referring to when we talk about Yarvin is considerably more expansive than just this, right? Obviously, the two are related, but what figures like Yarvin or Peter Thiel and the various neo-authoritarians out there want is a much more kind of formalistic transition from a democratic society, or at least a partially democratic society, to one where there's, in Yarvin's terminology, a kind of CEO and chief who's going to govern us. And sometimes this is framed even in terms of freedom, right? They'll say that, if ordinary people don't have a say in how they're governed, then they'll be free from politics. Other times it's framed in terms of efficiency gains, right? Yarvin will famously say things like, well, think about, the cell phone that you have in your hand that was built by a monarchy, quote unquote, right? A large company that, is governed by a CEO that has very few restrictions on his power. Although I would say that actually in the real world, it's actually workers who build things like cell phones, right? I can't really think of too many CEOs where they're on the factory floor single-handedly putting all the different phones together, right? So unitary executive theory definitely relates to this, but their aspirations, at least intellectually, are a lot more expensive.
Right. And so I guess in the context of the zone being flooded with bullshit, as Bannon says, I found that
Mhm.
the notion of oligarchy is a good way to kind of tie together the various threads of how we critique the Trump administration, and that's what Bernie Sanders is up to with this Fight Oligarchy tour. Of course, he's going to all these competitive districts, all these red areas, and talking
Mhm.
about how Trump has contributed to America's oligarchic nature. And so, I guess what is the relationship between these authoritarian policies and oligarchy? And do you think oligarchy is a good kind of way to kind of weave all of this critique together?
I do, right? I mean, plutocracy is another term that you could also use, but it hasn't really caught on. So I think we need to go further back here, really to the founding of the country. So I see some moderate Democrats who will sometimes be critical of Trump and Trumpism and oligarchy by appealing to constitutional style rhetoric, right? The intimation being this isn't the way things were supposed to be. It was supposed to be different. Actually, if you go read Madison in Federalist 10, Madison actually sounds a bit like a Marxist, except a Marxist who thinks that the ruling class should win. He says, look, in any given society, there are going to be many different causes for division, religious causes, cultural causes, moral causes. But by far, the biggest reason for any kind of division in society is over property or the talents and capacities people have to acquire property. And he even says in Federalist 10 that the chief task of modern legislation should be to try to ameliorate the different tensions that emerge from class conflict, right, between the class that has property and those who don't, which are enduring divisions in society. And he's very unambiguous about the fact that he thinks that a purely democratical society would be deeply problematic because it would allow the mass of people who have very little property way too much of a say in how society is organized to the disadvantage of those who have property. So the American Constitution and its founders intended for a certain kind of natural aristocracy to emerge that was going to run most of the basic functions of the country in order people were going to have relatively little say in how things went. And so seen from that perspective, the appearance and the importance of oligarchy in our day is neither unusual or unexpected, right? Again, it's not the system failing to work the way it's supposed to. In some senses, the system working exactly the way it's supposed to, which is why I think leftists need to be far more averse to what Aziz Rana, the great constitutional scholar, calls creedal constitutionalism, right? The idea that the Constitution is some kind of silver bullet that we can appeal to kind of banish all our ideological enemies. Flashing forward to the present, right? Again, I think that there's an enormous amount of empirical research that has shown that despite efforts in the 20th century to kind of roll back the power of propertied elites, a lot of that has been undone since the advent of the neoliberal age, right? Reagan, Thatcher, a couple of others, right? So just to cite three studies, right? Martin Gilens, in his book Affluence and Influence and subsequent papers, researched how likely it was that ordinary citizens in America could impact the law or how to say and how they were governed. And the conclusion that he reached by acquiring or accumulating an enormous amount of empirical data was that ordinary citizens in America, and this is back in the 2010s, by the way, pre-Trump, they had almost no say in how they were governed, right? It was very unlikely that ordinary citizens would see their preferences enacted into law. But he did point out that if you were a large corporate entity or you were rich, you became far more likely to see your preferences enacted into law, right? To the point where it wasn't quite a one-to-one correlation, right? This is what the rich wanted and this is what happened, but it was fairly close, right? And he points out that this is regardless of what party happened to be in power. Flashing forward to another study, Thomas Piketty, right, reached the same conclusions in his 2020 book, not the one that everyone has read, but his bigger book, Capital and Ideology, right, which similarly looks at various different countries across the Western world and points out that since the advent of the neoliberal era, we've once again seen skyrocketing economic inequalities. And this has been complemented, as it always is, by increasing forms of political inequality, as the rich, quite naturally, do just what Adam Smith said that they would do, right? They use their wealth in order to acquire political power for themselves, so they can then acquire more wealth and then more political power, right? No surprise there. And then just the last study that I wanted to cite was Eatwell and Goodwin's 2018 book on global populism. So what they point out, and I should point out, both of them are pretty conservative social scientists. That aside, right? They point out that there's this widespread perception on the part of many Western citizenries that they have very little say in how that they are governed. That elites in power, regardless again of which party they happen to be speaking for, don't care about ordinary people, although they do care about the interest of moneyed global elites. And what Equal and Goodman point out is that by and large, the beneficiaries of the anger that this has produced have been the populist right. You know, people railing against global elites, open borders, that kind of thing, right? And, you know, we shouldn't be surprised, you know, because those perceptions, to go back to Gillen's and Piketty, are accurate, right? It's not that ordinary people are misguided about how things work. That's true. I just think that contra Eatwell and Goodwin, it's not a good thing that ordinary people are being persuaded to look to right-wing populism as a solution, because I don't think it's a solution. In fact, I think it's a worsening of the problem.
Yeah, and so I guess I'm just wondering, how have oligarchs used authoritarianism to maintain their rule? Because I go back to say, like you did, the revolutionary period, or not the revolutionary period, but let's say the 1790s. We had things like the Alien and Sedition Acts, and the Alien and
Mhm.
Sedition Acts were interesting because we would think we have, more of a right to free speech than that. But if I understand correctly, the Supreme Court said, well, you can't stop the publication of speech, but you can punish certain speech acts if they have certain implications. And I'm no constitutional scholar, but that's my understanding. And that kind of reminds me of what the Trump administration has done to, say, Palestinian activists or people like James Comey, or the Reddit, Letitia James, or Adam Schiff, just going after their opponents to punish them. So what, and what's like the motive behind all this? Like, why does Trump want to enrich himself? Why does Trump want an oligarchy? Is it just to enrich himself? Is it just so he can sell Bitcoin and sell pardons and things like that?
I think that's part of it, right? I mean, Trump has a seemingly limitless appetite for money, status, power, you name it, right? So anyone who thinks that he's going to be just being the billionaire president is naive, right? He really has a kind of Alexandrian personality, right? Francis Fukuyama put it in terms of thymos, right? This desire to be the biggest, the most impressive person in the land, and have people build statues in his honor long after he's dead, right? And more money obviously is conducive to that end. But in terms of what is it that the oligarchs want, I mean, look, that's a huge conversation, right? We could go all the way back to the origins of this country again, in terms of the Constitutional Convention and the protections for property that were very carefully and very insistently kind of baked in to inhibit democratic majorities, many of which would be poor or at least comparatively propertyless, from interfering in the well-being of the propertied. But let's say a little bit more current, right? So two things, right? First off, poll after poll has repeatedly shown that the American public is very, very happy with, or even expects the rich to pay their fair share in terms of taxation, right? And that's true across parties, and it's especially true amongst independents and amongst Democrats. Everybody wants the rich to pay more, and yet, by and large, the thrust of American tax policy over the last 40, 50 years, almost now, has been in the opposite direction, right? From the comparatively progressive taxation that you saw in the mid 20th century to a very regressive tax system that has helped bring about what Thomas Piketty calls a new Gilded Age. In some ways, a system that's actually worse than the Gilded Age in terms of the starkness of these inequalities. And I want to point out this isn't just true in the United States. This is true across the board in many Western states. Large numbers of people, large majorities in most cases, support more heavily taxing the rich. The rich don't want to be taxed, and they use their influence to make sure that whoever is going to be in power, that's not going to happen, right? Another more contentious example, but one I think we should still draw some attention to, is Medicare for All, a more specifically American example. So obviously, almost every other developed state in the world, across the world, I should say now too, including in many of the thriving East Asian countries, there is a well-functioning public healthcare system. It takes a lot of different forms, and some of them are more generous than others. Some, like in my home country of Canada, have become more generous recently, right? Dental care was recently included under the auspices of public medicine. But the United States is really an outlier on this front. And that's one of the reasons why American medicine, American healthcare is the most expensive in the entire world, and why it was recently, the American health system was recently ranked one of the worst in the developed world, right? The Commonwealth Foundation and the Gaddam Institute ranked American healthcare as falling somewhere between Armenia's and Algeria's, right? So it's not even in the running compared to France, the UK, let alone the Nordic states that perennially top these lists, right? That's how bad things are getting, right? Americans pay an enormous amount for medicine and get very, very little in return compared to every other rich country and even some middle-income countries now, right? The American public increasingly seems to be deeply aware of this and wants change, right? You've seen increasing support for things like Medicare for All year in, year out, right? For about the last 10, 15 years at this point. Despite that, right? Very few politicians, even in the Democratic Party, are willing to sign off on something like Medicare for All, even though it would very clearly be very, very popular, right? Of course, very few Republicans, if any, would be willing to sign off on something like that. Maybe a couple of idiosyncratic post-liberals, but no one meaningful. Why is that, right? Because amongst other things, the health industry and political elites don't want there to be change. This is an extremely profitable industry, one which reaps enormous dividends for the people who are at its summit. Why would they want that to change? Right? It's basically an gilded piggy bank from which you can extract tens of billions of dollars. And if not even the poor, but the middle classes in America suffer under it, then who cares? It's not like they're contributing all that much to society anyway, from the perspective of these people.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of answers the question of why the oligarchy is so cruel to working people. And I guess it's because they make so much money off of it and they think working people aren't really contributing much to society. Because I look at something like the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, which many have taken to call the Big Ugly Bill. And it's so cruel. And as Stephen Miller said, the cruelty is the point. Because it's not just that the rich gave themselves another massive tax break, it's that they have to cut food stamps for working people who aren't making enough money to get by.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And a lot of people kind of struggle to understand this on the progressive end of the spectrum, right? They tend to adopt a more democratic or utilitarian attitude towards these things, saying, look, why is it that very rich people need millions of dollars more to fund their yachts and to fund their first class tickets, et cetera, but ordinary people don't need basic access to health services. That doesn't seem to make sense. But from the inner perspective of a lot of the people defending this standpoint, to the extent that they are willing to defend it ideologically and not just say, well, this works for me, they'll say, look, the reality is, if you are rich and you are powerful, then you have earned, everything that you have acquired. It might even be that because you are part of society's elite, that you are more likely to be effective in spending the money and using the resources that you have available to you. By contrast, there's this long meritocratic tradition of implying that the poor in this country are deserving of their own poverty and their own precarity. And if that's the case, why should we do anything for them? And moreover, aligned with the second point I made, there's this longstanding argument that you can see in people like Ayn Rand, for example, that says, what are the poor going to do with more money anyway? If they're poor, it's because they couldn't cut it. You give them more money, they're just going to waste it on beer and popcorn and other kind of luxuries, so called. So don't give them anything, right? They should be content with what they have.
Yeah, so we've talked about taxes, and I guess taxes are fueling the oligarchy because, as you said, the more money they have, the more power they have, the more power they have, the more money they have. It's a self perpetuating feedback loop, and they want to make a lot of money, and they feel like the working people don't actually do much or would waste money if they had it. So, what is the drive behind the Trump administration getting rid of all these regulations? So, they just got rid of a lot of he just got rid of the endangerment principle, which was established by the Obama administration. So why does the oligarchy want to get rid of all these regulations, and how is it going to affect working people?
Sorry.
I said, why does the oligarchy want to get rid of all these regulations, and how is it going to affect working people?
Sure. Well, Ian Shapiro, the Yale political theorist, had a very good metaphor to describe the rich's attitude towards money. Uh, for a long time, bourgeois economists presupposed that most people were driven by the doctrine of marginal utility, including the rich, right? Which basically holds that if you have no dollars and then all of a sudden you can get a dollar, then that $1 is pretty meaningful to you, right? Similarly, if you have no dollars and you get $10, that's pretty damn meaningful for you, each additional dollar. $100 is better than $10, even if it's not quite as intrinsically valuable. You get the idea, right? And so the notion was like, look, once you hit $100 million, let's say, there's functionally nothing that you could buy with $1 billion that you pretty much couldn't buy with 100, 200 million, right? In terms of gratifying your desires. So no one's going to get a lot of additional value from getting, that $1 billion rather than the $100 million. There's not going to be a major motivation on the part of even the rich. Well, what Shapiro points out is actually the structure of the way that people pursue money, especially the rich, is a lot more like heroin. Uh, your first hit is pretty good, but then after a little while, that hit, the same hit doesn't really work. So you need bigger and bigger hits in order to get the same sense of euphoria. And you see expressions of this in things like The Social Network, right? $1 million is nice, but then after you've made $1 million and then $2 million and $3 million, each additional million doesn't really feel all that good. $1 billion, by contrast, that is something that feels a lot more exhilarating. So once you think of things in that way, you can see why it is that there's this compulsion. The richer you get to want more and more and more, right? Because you need bigger and bigger wins in order to obtain the same sense of rising the ladder, right? Gaining more riches and more power. In terms of the impact this is having on ordinary people and why the Trump administration is aligning with them. That's the second part of your question, right?
Yeah, you can speak to that, but I was also wondering how you think these regulations are going to affect working people. So, for example, or
Right.
these lack of regulations are going to affect working people. So, like, we're going to see probably like one of the biggest deregulatory eras in modern history, right? And we're
Mhm.
going to see the EPA not enforce air quality rules, and I'm just wondering how is all this going to hurt working people in America?
Well, I think there are a lot of different ways that it's going to hurt people, right? So, again, I think that we need to understand the conception of freedom that's operative here, which maps very, very closely on to the conception of distributive justice that I mentioned before. When a lot of conservatives and people on the right talk about freedom, they don't mean freedom for everyone, right? They mean freedom for those who have deserved freedom or come to deserve freedom and who best know what to do with it. And in the case of these deregulatory efforts or anti regulatory efforts, the view is if we allow the rich in society to do whatever they wish without any kind of compunctions or restrictions on what they're going to do, including those that were imposed by popular democratic mandate, then we'll all be better off because these are the kinds of people who know what to do with the freedom that we've given them, right? But clearly, there's no consistency here in terms of centralizing freedom in a worldview, since the Trump administration pretty clearly does not care very much about the freedom of, take your pick, right? Working class people, women, migrants, people who have been charged with pretty trivial criminal offenses down the line. And a lot of people like calling this out from a kind of libertarian perspective. But it makes perfect sense if you think, look, some people deserve all the freedom in the world, the Peter Thiels of the world, the Elon Musk of the world, etc. Others do not need the same level of freedom, and they actually might waste it or use it to threaten those who are more deserving if they're given too much agency. So I think that that's an important kind of ideological point to make. In terms of the concrete impact this is going to have, look, I think we're already starting to see this, right? RFK and his conspiracy peddling has meant that some pretty serious diseases that we thought had disappeared from the world are making a comeback. And I can't overstate what a tragedy this is. The efforts to eliminate things like smallpox and measles, et cetera, were coordinated over enormous periods of time, took vast resources, and you could consider it one of the major civilizational achievements of humanity to have gotten rid of them. And now, at the whim of somebody who probably has more brainworms than brain left in them. Let's just put it this way. All that's going to come apart, right? But beyond that, there's some more kind of insidious basis for this, right? Which is, of course, by getting rid of access to some of these inoculations and vaccines, or making it more difficult to acquire, we kind of prime people to think that they're not entitled to certain levels of medical care from their government. That if you get sick, then it's your responsibility to take care of it, right? Which is the kind of dark side of some of this libertarian rhetoric that surrounds things like vaccinations, right? There's kind of, in addition to the antisocial quality, a kind of, well, if you can't afford to get vaccinated or can't afford to take care of yourself, then why should we help you kind of mentality. Another good example that you brought up, of course, is the declining environmental standards that this administration seems really determined to, lean heavily on. So there's been an enormous amount of empirical research done that examines who are the primary victims of environmental decay. And surprise, surprise, it's almost always the poor, the racialized poor, especially in this country, Black communities, but the poor in general, right? Because things like smog, poor water quality, et cetera, enormously disproportionately impact poor communities. A good example of this would be obviously the water crisis that broke out in Michigan not too long ago, right? Where there was a kind of lapsing set of standards around maintaining water quality. And of course, there was an enormous amount of people who suffered as a result of it, many of them Black and almost all of them working class, right? I was living in Michigan not too long ago, like I said, and you could still see the kind of grim legacy of that everywhere you went, right? So there are just innumerable examples that we can bring up. And I'm not sitting there saying that progressives should defend every aspect of the regulatory state. I think that some regulations really are red tape. Some of them were put in place because these institutions have been captured by the very companies that they were supposed to regulate. This happens all the time. And in those kind of circumstances, something like Zoran's attitude, right, in New York, of rolling this back to allow people a little bit more freedom and to induce some economic efficiency could very well be warranted, right? There's nothing wrong with that whole "don't tread on me" attitude, but I really don't think that that's what's appeared in these kind of circumstances, right? The kind of Trump administration's attitude is "don't tread on me" if you happen to have $2 million or more, but absolutely everyone beneath that can be treaded upon. In fact, they probably should be, just to remind them of what their place is in society.
Your discussion of the oligarchs and drug addicts kind of makes me think that maybe it's the oligarchs who have too much freedom or don't know what's in their best interest. It kind of harkens back to something a teacher of mine said in a grad seminar. He said, even the capitalist is oppressed by capitalism. And when I look at how many rich people seem to suffer from severe psychiatric issues because of how hard they work, it makes me wonder if they're the ones who don't know what is in their best interest.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is an interesting and difficult problem, I think, for a lot of socialists, right? So let's just go back to Karl Marx, right? In Capital, Marx points out that the language that he's going to use to describe capitalists is by and large, surprise, very negative, right? Overwhelmingly negative. But he also makes clear that what he's talking about are not individual capitalists, but capitalists as a kind of a social group, right? Or capital as a social institution, if you prefer, that he kind of describes using this personalist language. But Marx is very well aware that, look, capitalists are not driven to do what they do out of malice. Sometimes they're not even driven to do it out of greed or egoism. It's market forces, the kind of new compulsion of capital that compels them to act the way that they do. Just to give one example, I worked at a grocery store for 7 years, as a cashier. One day we had somebody come in who tried to encourage us to unionize. They very quickly showed him the door. And the powers that be came down and said, look, the reality is that we cannot afford a union right now. They're opening a farm boy up across the street. There's a new grocery store that's probably going to go up any year now, just a little ways away. If we pay more in wages, then this place is going to go bust, right? And from their standpoint, they were completely sincere. I have no doubt that that was a worry. But the impact for all of us, of course, was that we didn't get a union, that our wages remained stagnant. And there was absolutely no way that you could support yourself working there, let alone living in the town at any level of reasonable well-being, right? So it's the mute compulsion of capitalism that induces many people including capitalists, to act the way that they do, which isn't to say that there aren't greedy, villainous capitalists, et cetera, out there. Definitely we could think of, Elon Musk type figures or Jeff Bezos, is another one that I can point to. And the reason I think this is a problem is from a technical socialist standpoint, what we need to talk about are social systems and social structures, right? Those are the problems and what we need to change. I think the problem with that in terms of practical politics is people don't really get animated all that frequently by abstract social structures and calling for their change, right? You need human villains to kind of personalize this a little bit, which is why, of course, so many socialists tend to make Musk the villain and Trump the villain, and Bernie Sanders did the same in his anti-oligarchy claim. So I'm not really sure how to reconcile these two different competing impulses together. On the one hand, the desire for intellectual honesty, saying it's social systems that are a problem. On the other, recognizing the strategic need to point to human and recognizable villains in order to mobilize progressive causes.
All right, well, hopefully this November we can get some more progressives and socialists in office who aren't bought and paid for by the oligarchy. Matt, thank you so much for coming back onto the podcast. We really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day, man.
You too. Take care, man. Bye-bye.